Today, NTV Wild Talk is coming to you from the only national park in the world that's located in a capital city. This is the Nairobi National Park, home to 100 species of mammals and 520 species of birds. It's also home to the headquarters of the Kenya Wildlife Service. Today, I speak to a man that's dedicated years of his life to the service, conservation and wildlife. He is the chairperson of the KWS, Dr. Richard Leakey. Born in December 1944 in Nairobi, Richard Leakey is the second son of paleontologist parents Louis Leakey and Mary Leakey. From choosing to spend his early childhood days collecting bugs and wild animals over schoolwork to finding fossils in Turkana and understanding the evolution of mankind, Leakey has led a life that's far from ordinary. In 1989, former President Daniel Arap Moi appointed him the first director of the Kenya Wildlife Service. During that time, Leakey survived a plane crash in 1993. He left the service and had a stint in politics. Leakey served as Secretary General of the Kenyan opposition party Safina, and in 1997 he was elected to an opposition seat in the Kenyan Parliament. But politics aside, Leakey is possibly best known for his major conservation efforts. He was the man behind the country's very first ivory stockpile burn in 1989, in which former President Moi set alight 12 tons of ivory to signify it is only valuable on a live elephant. Today, Richard Leakey continues to fight to protect the country's wildlife and to support the institution that is mandated to do so, the Kenya Wildlife Service. And now I am joined by Dr. Richard Leakey on NTV Wild Talk. We're coming to you from the Nairobi tented camp. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Leakey. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
How and where and when did you fall in love with wildlife and conservation?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, because falling in love is a particular way of looking at things. No, I don't think I'm in love. I just recognize it as a source of huge wonderment, huge pleasure. I think from a very early childhood, I enjoyed wild creatures. Whether I enjoyed them particularly because they never asked me questions that I couldn't answer, or there was so much you could learn. And I was talking to somebody recently and saying that one of the things we have to do at KWS is stop being so prescriptive about what you can do. I used to catch butterflies, I used to pick up beetles, I used to pick up odd creatures and take them to the National Museum and have them identified, and feel that I was breaking into science. I was doing something that was perhaps adding to knowledge. And I think when I was 4 or 5, finding something that the curator would say, "Oh, that's very interesting. Where did you get that?" That gave me a huge charge to devote my life to answering questions. And I think if we're going forward, we must try not to make it impossible for ordinary citizens to be curious and to satisfy their curiosity. They're not doing any harm. And we've now got rules that if you have a feather from a guinea fowl, without a permit, you're breaking the rules. I mean, really, can't we do better than that? I mean, I remember wearing feathers in my head and pretending I was some jock doing something. It was just part of being a child, and we shouldn't make it impossible. And chicken feathers are so boring.
Anyway, right. But what inspired you to get into wildlife and interest you in bugs, for all things? Was it your parents that inspired you or influenced you, or your surrounding, perhaps?
Well, my parents came from a scientific background. We used to get taken off as children to Rusinga Island before it was better known. My parents were looking for fossils. We were taken off to the Olduvai Gorge on the edge of the Serengeti, or other places. And we didn't have a family that had the resources to have many toys, and we didn't have the resources to invite friends. And so when my parents were doing their work, we were left to amuse ourselves, and it was great fun just getting to know what was in the compound. My parents never said anything was dangerous. They said, if it bites you, see how bad the bite is, or you know, if you tread on the snake, it may bite you, but that's because you hurt it. If you walk through a thick bush and there's some lion on the other side, it's your fault. You should have checked before you did that. So nature was just part of my life. I suppose in the same way that urban children today have things that amuse them. But I'm very, very saddened by the fact that so many of our young people are devoted to watching games, watching computer programs, having games where
Watching
you
the wrong kind of game.
kill each other.
Right.
I mean, really, surely we want to get away from that. And that's why I so welcome the NTV Wild initiative, because this can make a difference. This can give our young audience in Kenya a sense that they really have something very special. You could not have the opportunities in any other country than Kenya and maybe Tanzania and possibly South Africa.
Am I right in saying that when you were at school, you often skipped class to go out and investigate the wildlife around you and the little creatures?
Well, at different stages. Earlier on I skipped school just to get out of it. Later on I skipped school because I was trapping small mammals to sell for, I guess, peanuts, but made me some pocket money to companies that were making films. And Armand Dennis followed on the Disney tradition, and he wanted mongoose, he wanted bush babies, he wanted hyraxes, he wanted spiders, he wanted scorpions. And I could get 100 shillings for a big spider. I could get maybe 200 shillings for a bush baby that was alive and well, and when they'd finished filming, they let it go. But so I had traps and I had haunts, and the sooner I could get out of school, the better. And I didn't like school. I couldn't stand the idea of being asked to answer questions that the teacher knew the answers for. Why not ask me something they didn't know?
Right.
But why should I know what 2 + 7 equals when the teacher clearly can say right or wrong? Why didn't he just tell me it equals 7, finish?
But having said that, you have achieved a lot when it comes to education. You've got 17 or more honorary doctorate degrees, if I'm correct, and you are also you have also been recognized for one of the highest achievements.
Well, I think the honorary degrees in some way, I mean, yes, I'm honored, I'm flattered, particularly when you get honorary doctorates from Cambridge University and some of the big universities. But to a certain extent, you know, for me, it doesn't take much work, and it's rather like my enjoyment as a kid of wearing guinea fowl feathers. I mean, it's something to decorate yourself with. I think the Royal Society of London, the oldest scientific academy in the world, which you can't apply to be a member of, it takes a huge amount of peer review to get recognized and then to get a unanimous vote in support. That meant a tremendous amount to me. Only one other Kenyan, I think, has ever been recognized, and that was Calestus Juma before me. It's a very, very hard award to get, and that gave me, I suppose, a real sense of satisfaction. It humbled me.
What exactly were you recognized for?
Well, the citation was rather strange. It was for contributions to natural knowledge. Not to nature, not to prehistory, not to any particular science, but to natural knowledge. And this was a citation that used to be given in the old days, 200-300 years ago, when people like Charles Darwin were made fellows. And it reflected people who hadn't had a university training. I was one of the first, for many years, of plain, simple Mr. Leakey, no university background. Right. To become a fellow, and I think the citation was really getting at the fact that through my curiosity in prehistory, anthropology, archaeology, botany, entomology, herpetology, and also obviously conservation, that my efforts over a lifetime had improved the package of knowledge that humanity can live with, and it was. Yeah, it was very flattering, actually, because I'm not conscious of having set out to contribute, but I've had fun doing what I do.
Well, tell us more about that, because you still do a lot of work in Turkana.
Well, I think there are 3 big questions in life. What's the origin of the universe? What's the origin of life upon it, including our own? And what's the destiny of this planet in terms of where we may go? Philosophers, scientists, theologians have all tried to answer that question. Those 3 questions are the foundation, if you like, of of a conscious mind. These are the questions that everybody asks at some point in their life. You look at the heavens, you wonder what's up there. Why do stars twinkle? Why does the moon keep appearing at the same point every day, but moving up and down the horizon? Why do creatures live the way they do, interact the way they do? What has done this? What has brought about this extraordinary spectacle of living organisms, from microorganisms under our feet in the soil that you never see, to the extraordinary animal that we are? And that's a very important question to answer. And of course, the question is, was there a Big Bang? How did it happen? What's the origin of matter? All of that comes in. And my parents had started work, my father particularly, to pick up on Darwin's notion that Africa was the origin of humanity. In those days, in the 20s and 30s of the last century, he was ridiculed. He said, no, humans couldn't have come from Africa. They're such primitive people.
Wow.
They're not really people anyway, was the attitude. And so he set out with his career and limited resources to answer those questions, and he and my mother, their colleagues, did a lot of work. I was fortunate in that I was able to continue their work, partly on the foundation they had built, partly on my own resources that I was able to raise. And most of my working career has been devoted to answering how did we come into existence as we are? What are we? When did we become human? What is human? Now, a lot of viewers of this program inevitably say, yeah, but you know, this is irrelevant. You're an atheist. You don't really have any faith in the Creator. And my answer is, you know, you can accept a Creator and you can think of the Genesis story, but there's no proof. It's just a story. Now, I want something that anybody can pick up and see and measure, compare. I want empirical evidence, not hearsay.
Right.
And so my career largely has been based on, if we have evolved, as we now know we have for sure, did it really happen only in Africa? And if in Africa, where in Africa? And what were the circumstances?
And have you managed to find answers to a lot of these questions?
We found enough evidence now for there be no question that Africa is the home of humanity. No question that all the major events over the last 5 million years have come out of Africa, including fully modern people. Now, there are many more questions. I mean, when did skin color turn to what it is today? When did dark eyes as opposed to light eyes? Well, that you have to delve into genetics and microbiology, and that too is moving apace. I'm not involved. But, you know, we can say that until about 10, 15,000 years ago, everybody on the planet was dark-skinned.
Right.
It's a very recent development to get this challenged pigment that some of us have.
And that work continues to take place in
continues
Turkana.
very emphatically, yes. It's going on at Lake Turkana largely. There's other work being done in Ethiopia by other people, a large amount of work being done in South Africa.
Right.
But the main focus, I think, of our story can probably be related to the work at Lake Turkana, both on the Lodwar side, the Turkana side, and on the other side, the east side of the lake.
Let's talk about your other work that you're heavily involved in, and that is being the chairperson of the Kenya Wildlife Service, which you currently are, but you got involved back in the early 90s. How did you get into the KWS?
Well, back in 1989, I was at a stage where I was tired of running the National Museum, and I think I was tired partly because it had no funding. The government subsidy in those days was quite small. It was like driving a bus, well, a nice bus, but it wasn't something that gave you any challenges. I was getting bored with looking for fossils, partly because I'd done it a long time, and partly because we simply didn't have enough money then to really put the emphasis that we needed to, and have done since. And I had wanted to start a big museum in Africa, and I was working with the late Julius Nyerere and General Obasanjo with a view to creating a unique exhibit on the story of humanity, starting with the cell and building up to the molecules and eventually to the DNA story and ultimately to the beginnings of primate life and all the way through. We also wanted to bring back to Africa many of the cultural relics that had been collected in the colonial era and taken to European museums, American museums, and which were not allowed back into Africa by those museums because they felt that Africa didn't have the stability or the professionalism to hold them. And so we thought we'd create a big museum with a lot of money and persuade these countries to give the specimens back to Africa with guarantees. And as and when other countries in Africa got their museums up to a level where they could protect these priceless treasures, they could perhaps return. The late Julius Nyerere decided after he was leaving the presidency that he wanted to write books and he wanted to deal with some of his international commitments. So he said, put it on hold for a few years. General Obasanjo said, you know, Richard, if Mwalimu's not with us, the two of us won't have the clout that he has.
Right.
So put it on hold. So I returned $1 million, which would be about 10 million today, to a foundation to give it into us. And I was wondering what to do next when I was asked by an intermediary whether I could see President Moi. We weren't particularly close friends at the time, so I went to see him at his invitation. And he said, would you create the Kenya Wildlife Service and take over wildlife? And I said, well, why me? And he had his own reasons for that. And because I wanted to get out of the museum job, and my big job had stalled, I thought, well, that could be a lot of fun to start a government agency. And we got into a discussion, and I said, yes, I will. But in those days, the government of the country, wanted wildlife security to be in the hands of the police, and they wanted us to deal with butterflies and beetles, but to leave all the security to the military people. And I said it won't work. And if you want us to form a good wildlife authority, give us the authority to train a paramilitary unit that can tackle poaching, an intelligence unit that can stop poaching. And it took some months of discussion, but at the end of the day, the cabinet under Moi agreed that the Kenya Wildlife Service would be established, and it would be the first state corporation, I think probably in the entire Commonwealth, not just Africa, but the whole world, where civilians in a state corporation working under corporate rules would be allowed to bear arms and establish a unit that could fight armed militia who were killing our wildlife.
But that didn't go down very well at some point, did it?
Well, it went down very well once it was working, and then it became slightly worrying. People thought, well, if he can beat up the Somali poachers with his men, and the Somali poachers have now stopped killing elephants, what else could he do with his armed men? And I think there started to be what I would call wah-wah, rumouring, that perhaps I was working with people behind the scenes with a view to assisting or initiating some military takeover. I mean, complete and utter rubbish. However, politicians feed on rubbish a lot, and they were very happy to use it as a whip to beat me with. The fact that I might have been starting an army to overthrow the country was complete nonsense. But what really upset people was that we had raised as KWS 155 million US. And the briefcase contractors started appearing on my doorstep and saying, we can supply helicopters, we can supply trucks, we can build bridges. These are people who had never seen a helicopter. And I said, no, there's no corruption in KWS. You will not get any contract unless you're qualified. That upset a lot of people who saw not a kitu kidogo, but kitu kubwa coming their way by skimming off some of these very large contracts. And once it was clear I was not going to participate in any corruption, then they joined forces and ultimately made it impossible for me to be the director.
Dr. Leakey, there was an incident when you faced a near-death experience as the chairperson of the KWS, and I'll come to that after the break. We are just going to take a short breather here on NTV Wild. I am speaking to Dr. Richard Leakey, the chairperson of the Kenya Wildlife Service. We're coming to you from the Nairobi tented camp here in the Nairobi National Park. First, though, let us bring you your opportunity to win a fabulous prize. It's time for our Wild Guess question, and I hope you've been listening keenly, because our question today is, what is the highest recognition that Dr. Leakey has achieved? That's what is the highest recognition that Dr. Leakey has achieved. Our hashtag is NTV Wild. You can contact us on any of our social media outlets. The first person to get the right answer first will win a prize. Do stay with us. More on the other side. Hello and welcome back to NTV Wild Talk. My guest is the chairperson of the KWS, Dr. Richard Leakey. Before we get back into discussion, a quick reminder of our Wild Guest question. You can win an awesome prize if you tweet us or Facebook us the correct answer. Our question, what is the highest recognition that Dr. Leakey has achieved? The first person to send in the correct answer will win a prize. The hashtag is NTV Wild. The question is, what is the highest recognition that Dr. Leakey has achieved? Dr. Leakey, you have faced death twice. Once when you were a child, you fell off a horse and fractured your skull. Tell us about the second experience.
Well, I fell off the horse because I didn't feel safe, and I landed on my head on a stone, and I fractured my skull, and I was in a coma and unconscious for 3 weeks, but I recovered. I've had many close calls. I had a bad plane accident and lost my legs while I was in KWS, and that appears to have been possibly related to the fact that I wasn't very popular.
There were reports that perhaps it was sabotage. Do you believe that?
You know, was it sabotage? I know it could have been sabotage, and I know that I wasn't a bad pilot, and I know that the engine failed. And in inspecting the aircraft after the crash, there were several things that could have been the result of sabotage, but equally, if you hit a bunch of trees in the ground at 70 miles an hour, some things can detach, and it was never possible to say. Before the crash, I'd had a number of rather ominous warnings that unless I played ball on some things which were corrupt, unless I became more amenable, that I would have a bad end. And there were public calls for me to step away from wildlife because I was not helping. Well, when you have a lot of that going on and the government doesn't seem to be backing you, one could get the impression that it was maybe an intended accident, but let's emphasize accident rather than intended. I have no idea, and I don't care. The point is, if somebody wanted to kill me, they failed.
They failed.
But
right, here you are, several years later. All right, well, you did in fact, though, leave the service, didn't you, after that?
Well, not immediately. I came back and did some more time, but it became very clear that I wasn't popular in coming back. There were a lot of obstacles being placed in my way, and the same obstacles are there today. There was a claim that KWS was more interested in wildlife than welfare of people. Yeah, but the Kenya Wildlife was established for the benefit of wildlife. It wasn't established for social welfare. And we were taking a hard line on a number of things, including poaching, illegal grazing in the parks, corruption. And in those days, there was a certain amount of thought that by mob action, you could change the rules, and so it just became so stressful.
Yeah. Well, you did then eventually come back to the service. Now you are the chairperson of the Kenya Wildlife Service. Still, though, the service and the nation at large faces similar issues to what it did back then in the early 90s. You just mentioned them, poaching, although that has reduced significantly here in Kenya. Illegal grazing is a big problem in every park in the country. What has been your biggest hurdle at the KWS?
Well, I think the wildlife conflict is probably the single biggest worry, not because it's manifesting everywhere, but because where it expresses itself, it gets a lot of media. And it has created and continues to create a negative political climate in which to proceed with conservation. And there's somehow a sense that KWS is failing if a 5-ton animal walks through somebody's shamba and helps himself to some sugar cane or maize. Now, what you've got to remember is that 20 years ago, there was no sugar cane or maize because the human population was much smaller. But the elephants have been there long before people even knew what sugarcane and maize was, thousands of years ago. So we have a problem. The parks were created with no thought to the fact that the human population was going to expand, no thought to the notion that with pesticides and fertilizers and irrigation, people could grow crops in semi-arid lands. And we have these significant areas of land for wildlife with people up to the edges and people trying to get in. Now, increasingly, people not only trying to get in, but they're bringing their cattle in. And there's a couple of very interesting things happening. A lot of people are creating conservancies on their own land with tour operators and hoteliers. But the hoteliers and tour operators say, we'll bring tourists, but they're not coming to see your cattle. So the landowner often says, well, I can move the cattle away. But there's not another planet to put them on. The only place they can put them is in the national park.
Well, what is KWS doing about this?
Well, we can plead, we can argue, we can hope people will be reasonable. But the answer is we have to put a fence between people and animals. It has to be a fence that does not allow one or other party to cross. This will be an extraordinarily expensive piece of work. I think $300 million US.
And is that the reason as to why it hasn't been done already in all these years?
Yes, I think the fences we put up are pathetic. People can cross them, cut them. It's a lot of money, and KWS wasn't in a good shape to borrow a lot of money. I think we can now move towards a concessional loan with the World Bank and other donors. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we will build impenetrable barriers. And so the wildlife conflict from park animals or reserve animals will stop. Lions, buffalo, elephant, and others who cause pastoralists and agriculturalist problems. And we will stop people giving the lions and the elephants and the hippos a problem by keeping their cattle out of the park.
Right. KWS, of course, faces several challenges such as those, but many accuse the service of some rangers that are too lax in their duty. There have been allegations of corruption. There have also been allegations of rangers colluding with poachers in the whole fight when it comes to poaching. What's your comment on that?
Well, I think it proves Kenyans work for KWS as they do for the police and the army and the teachers. And Kenya is a poor country. We do not pay our staff, whether we're the police or any other branch of government, adequate salaries. And if you have laxity in management, and if you have a don't care less attitude, poor morale, poor leadership, these things will happen. Now, there's no reason to believe that KWS will always be a corrupt organization, any more than you would wish that on the police or anybody else. We as a country have got to pull ourselves together and realize that if a person in business expects to have clean water, access to good health, why shouldn't a ranger? Now, our job is to build up the resources so that our rangers can focus on their job, our wardens can focus on their job, without having to worry with a second job. And the second job is accepting money to put cattle in the park, accepting money to turn the blind eye when there's poaching, and many other bad things. Now, as our president has said, corruption is our biggest enemy at the moment. But I don't believe it's an enemy that can't be fought and vanquished. We just have to work at it. But we also have problems with this wildlife conflict. This standard gauge railway has come through the park in Savo. Let's talk about Savo. Elephants used to cross where the railway is. This railway is on a 30-metre embankment that is at this angle. Elephants are confused.
Yeah.
How on earth can they follow the migration trails that they've followed for hundreds of years? At the moment, if you were to have a conversation with the Savo elephants, which you can't, but you can analyze from their behavior, they're totally confused as to what they're supposed to do. I think the Savo situation will be helped by fencing. I think we're going to have to look very hard at people now cultivating along the railway reserve outside the park, because elephants can smell watermelons and maize. And you know, we have a tough fight, and it's going to take money. But equally, I don't think if you're a Kenyan, where wildlife is such a valuable part of the national heritage, we should feel that wildlife is a bad thing. The SGR hasn't helped, but there may be a silver lining. Maybe the SGR and Salvo will teach us more about management than we've been forced to believe in the previous years.
Here in the Nairobi National Park, there has been a lot of controversy with regard to the standard gauge railway. What effort has KWS made in trying to fight its case? Because, as you say, the SGR will have a big impact on the environment here.
Well, I think if the SGR were to come through the Nairobi Park as per one plan that was being considered, may still be for all I know, would have been a disaster. We've made the position of KWS very clear. We're opposed to that and will resist it. But the Kenya Railways Corporation has responsible leadership. The government has responsible people. And I think the concerns that we have expressed have been taken on board. There are ongoing discussions. KWS enjoys a very good relationship with the Kenya Railways Corporation, and we have to work together anyway because of Salvo and the route through the other side of this park. And I don't want to give away the content of the discussion at the moment, because we don't know the final outcome. But am I hopeful that the Nairobi Park will not be damaged? I'm very hopeful.
What's the likelihood that it won't be damaged?
Well, I think very high. I can't promise anybody. I'm just one person. But the Board of Trustees, many individuals in government, many senior citizens, have all joined in the cause. Look, there are alternatives. They have financial implications. But Nairobi Park is not free land. Nairobi Park is an extraordinary part of Kenya's image. It's the only city of millions in the world,
Right,
where you can look out of a hotel window in Nairobi and you can see open space with binoculars, see buffalo, giraffe, and you come into it and you see lion, leopard, and cheetah, and many other things. This is too important. You could not put a price value on the Nairobi Park. You can put a price on a kilometre of rail. Let's find the extra money, if indeed it requires extra money, and save what will be an enormous jewel in Kenya's crown as we go forward. And as Kenya develops, that this government takes us forward, we get industrial development, we get better wealth, we pay people like our rangers and wardens more money, our teachers better salaries, kids smarter, we move beyond the digital technology into another era. We have to have the Nairobi Park, there's no question.
what is the impact of the SGR on the park in terms of its wildlife?
Well, so far I don't think there's any impact. There's certainly some disturbance along the eastern boundary, but it's a few hundred meters into the park at most. I think that'll settle down, and in a few years people will go to see the railway crossing these wide spans of bridges, and there'll be some people take pictures of, and people won't feel bad about it. I think you'll have animals going underneath, and I think there won't be a negative impact. There is a possible more worrying thing with the southern bypass. The park has been effectively reduced. We own the land, we own both sides of the road. But, you know, people living in Nairobi realize that getting from Langata, Karen into the city centre is impossible without a bypass. It's happened, it's going to go forward. The next stage of the SGR is under discussion, and I'm certainly not a pessimist. I'm very hopeful that our partners, particularly the Kenya Railways Corporation, and the government, the ministers and the president, will find a way for a win-win.
Dr. Leakey, in all your years here in the KWS service, what do you believe to be your biggest achievement?
Well, I think we built an organisation that is the envy of wildlife organisations across the continent. Whether you go to South Africa with their inflated ideas of how good they are, they also recognise that KWS is a serious competitor for the top spot. I don't think they're really a serious competitor. I think we are on the top spot. We shouldn't rest on our laurels. We have had poaching. We brought it back under control. We have a people in Kenya who are willing to support wildlife, even though they've never enjoyed it. And I think your TV programming now is going to make a big difference. I think the achievement I would take most pride in is there's an existing establishment called the Kenya Wildlife Service that is there, it's real, it works, it's smart, and it has, even though we have huge financial problems, it's not going to go away. The Kenya Wildlife Service is there to stay and to contribute to the development of our nation. That, I think, is what perhaps I'm most pleased about.
Dr. Leakey, you told us all about your childhood and how when you were a child, that's how you got interested and curious in wildlife and various creatures. How do you think we can encourage the children of today and people like our politicians to get interested in conservation issues?
Well, conservation issues are far more important and long-lasting than contemporary politics. So I think politicians need to realise that we're talking about something that is part of Kenya forever. Their political views at the moment are for the moment. So I think politicians owe it to our nation to get involved and support conservation. Our children need to be able to participate in conservation. They need to come to the parks. They need to have transport. They need to have films. They need to have school curricula change. They need to have wildlife quizzes. There's so much more that we can do. And we must, people have said to me, why is it that the Europeans and English people are so concerned if some lions get killed in Kenya? I said, because those lions have been in their homes on film. They know them by name. They know their children. They know their mothers and when they were born. Our people have never been shown these films. The TV channels have been too expensive to get or too costly to get licenses. The filmmakers have never insisted. We've never really thought about it. And you can't fall in love if you don't know what it is that you can fall in love with. And so we've got to do much more. We've got to bring our prices down. We've got to get access more open. And we've got to start educating people. You don't have to go to a national park to enjoy wildlife. You can watch different species of ant, predator, prey, and have a day's fun in figuring out what's going on.
Well, you've certainly had a very, very interesting childhood and your time in politics and at the helm of the KWS. What has been your wildest experience in the wild?
I was once in a boat in Ethiopia, a small boat, with 3 other people on the Omo River, which was in flood. There were literally hundreds of crocodiles inside. And I was in the middle of the river, about 100 meters from the edge of the river on both sides. And one of my passengers, I was facing forward, they were facing backwards, said, oh, there's a very large crocodile coming upon us. And I turned over and I could see this head about 30 meters behind us, and it clearly had every intention of eating us. I had a very underpowered engine, and so I thought I'd steer for the bank, but it then was clear the crocodile had more power than I did, and we had to meet him. So I turned the boat round, but not quick enough, and the crocodile bit the side of the wooden boat, splintered some wood. My passengers went to the other side of the boat, the crocodile let go, and we very nearly capsized. However, we righted ourselves. We were now close to the bank. The crocodile circled around and came up behind us, bit the back of the boat where I was sitting. We hit the bank at not fast enough, but quite fast, and were thrown from the boat with the crocodile crunching on the back of the boat.
Really?
And I discovered I had lost my trousers.
Oh, gosh.
And the crocodile's front
wearing.
tooth had gone through my trouser belt, and I was detached from clothing.
Oh,
And the crocodile got very fed up, shaking my khakis, and went off, which was, it increased the pulse rate substantially.
I can imagine.
But we're here.
A lucky escape, another lucky escape,
Yes.
I should say. All right, Dr. Leakey, it's really been a pleasure. But something interesting that perhaps many people don't know is that you are very fluent in Swahili and many other languages too, including Kikuyu. I'd like you to give our viewers a message about the future of Kenya's wildlife and the importance of conserving it.
Wanyama wa pori ni yetu. Tunalinda, lakini si sababu yetu, ni sababu ya watoto yetu na watoto yao. Ikiwa tutashindwa sasa kati wa serikali ya uhuru, watoto wetu taona nini? Naomba tushirikiane, tusiweke ng'ombe kwa paka. Na nikimaliza, naomba wasasi walete watoto watembelee paka. Pesa si nyingi, chupa 3 tu. Ingiza watoto, wafurahishwe na wanyama, waende nyumbani waseme hii wanyama tuhifadhi, tuwachane kuharibu. Hiyo ni maombi yangu.
Dr. Leakey, thank you so much for joining us on NTV Wild Talk. It's been a pleasure having you. You have a fascinating story and no doubt it's only going to get better.
Thank you.
This is NTV Wild Talk. Here is what you can expect coming up on Saturday night.
One of the most widespread tales in Africa concerns not these spectacular creatures, but a bird that is said to be a rainmaker, king of all the birds in Africa. Is he chosen for his size? If so, it would have to be the ostrich, or for his beauty. There are candidates of every color, shape and size. Is he chosen because he is powerful, or does he just have powerful allies, friends in high places? The legends say the hammerkop is the king of Africa's birds. And until science unravels some of the mysteries of the lightning bird, who are we to say he is not?
That's it on NTV Wild Talk. I'm your host, Smriti Vidyarthi, coming to you from the incredible Nairobi National Park. Join me again next week, same time, different location.